For those who don't know, Conrad is my brother, and he's an architect based in Namibia. And today we're going to talk about the William Kentridge show that we got to see in Cape Town when I traveled to Cape Town in February. Conrad, before we dive into that, I want to ask you a question that I ask everyone that comes onto this podcast. When did you first know that you're a creative?
No, that I must say that's quite an interesting question. I think it's something that develops over time. It takes quite an enormous effort to get to the point where I think one would think, well, maybe I am creative. So it was not something that came naturally, perhaps. It takes a lot of time and practice to get to a point where something comes naturally. I think like playing any musical instrument, it takes 10,000 hours to get to a point where you'd say, well, now I'm in a position to just create creatively, and it comes naturally. And I think the same with being a creative individual, whether we call it a designer, it in my experience, it was quite a long road and hours that had to be put in constantly, where with that idea of being a creative and responding creatively to a situation within your context. Yeah, where that's, I would say, started to happen. I actually had a discussion with a group of students the other day as well regarding the exact same thing, and I mentioned to them, that it's something that happens over a long period of time. So just hang in there. Slowly but surely, I think you practice the art of being creative and being a creative individual. I think it's one of those questions that one needs to think about a bit more. It's such an interesting question. Where does creativity comes from? And at what point can you argue that now I am a creative, individual? So I think there are the various thresholds that one moves through, in terms of your learning experience and the way you also see creativity, the way you experience it. So I think, yeah, that might be just a broad answer thinking about it. Um, Maybe at the end of the discussion, when one gathers your thoughts, it might turn out to be, slightly a different answer. So I think not the answer is not static to a question like that. It's because it's subjective. What
Absolutely. No,
creativity is.
it's a conversation that or a question that we can talk about for a long period of time. Maybe I should ask you again at the end of the podcast session.
Yeah, ask me again at the end of the discussion. Let's see what the answer is
So,
then.
Connor, today we're talking about well, we have shared this love for art and design, and in the past we've had these meetups where we would go see William Kentridge's work. For those who don't know, he's a South African artist. He works in such a wide range of media: filmmaking, drawing, theater production, and I've had the privilege of seeing his work in Cape Town and also in London, and he's definitely had an impact on my own practice. And so the first time the two of us saw one of his exhibitions was at the Zuidsmoka in Cape Town, and that was back in 2019. And that was a very interesting exhibition where they showcased his work over a long period of time. I had a look, actually, it's from 1955 to the present time, kind of showing the way that his work has developed over time. And now this more recent exhibition called History on One Leg at the A4 Arts Foundation in Cape Town was focused on showing his notebooks. So it was a collection of 30 notebooks. And what was so interesting was the way that they reproduced these notebooks so that the person who comes to the exhibition can actually page through it. And they did it so well that we weren't sure in the beginning if it's the actual notebook that we're able to page through, and we had to ask because it was done in such a professional way. So I'm really curious about his impact on your way of thinking as a creative, perhaps, or your work? I know that's also a very broad question, but maybe we can just start there.
Well, I think it actually builds upon your first question, of, well, it started off by when did I know perhaps that, I'm a creative individual? But then we also talked about the journey. And I think that, that is why the journey is so incredibly important as you establish yourself as a creative, being influenced by others. I think we are all, the way you're brought up, where you went to school, etc., it establishes a certain worldview. And then as you move along in life, you are influenced by others that are incredibly creative, and that essentially influence you in some cases a little, in other cases a lot, as an individual, and how you see yourself as a creative. And it's also that time for reflection on a personal level. And so William Kentridge, I think for me and for you, I can't speak for you, Lizanne, but in my case, absolutely. That first exhibition that we have seen at Zuidsmoka, which of course was a very high level exhibition, it made such an incredible impact on me, to just to do better. Saying it in layman's terms, looking at the body of work that he has presented is one thing. I mean, you can see that he's an incredible hard worker. How well that exhibition was curated, and then the content, which steps up the game to such an extent that one is in awe. It's so incredibly inspiring just to see how creative an individual can be, not just him, but an individual. So that was an incredible experience. The way that he filled and occupied every space, from the atrium, which is an enormous space, to fill. I think it's a very difficult space to fill, that incredible atrium space, and it did it, in such a clever way by filling the space with sound, that clicking sound that you hear anywhere, when you enter that space from any angle. So it was such a clever way to fill that space. And then from that enormous scale, it brings it down to smaller scale exhibitions to fill smaller rooms within, that gallery. And so he made use of the exhibition space, was incredibly clever. And then also the way it was put together, the curation of it all, the timeline, from the early works to, the highlights of his career. And then also certain spaces where he indicated or had mini exhibitions, opening up the door to his process, the process that he follows. And so I think the first exhibition was this lifetime achievement, or an exhibition celebrating lifetime of work. Whereas with a second exhibition, well, it's much smaller in scale, and it's only a celebration of process work. So, the second exhibition that we have seen at the A4 Foundation, it really just takes one aspect of that major exhibition and celebrating that one aspect of his creative process, which is then, of course, the sketchbook. And it's such a humble thing, the sketchbook. It's something that you will not necessarily see on exhibition. It might be amongst other things that, together with another body of work, there is a sketchbook available for those to see. But I've never thought of, well, let's visit an exhibition that is only, an celebration of the initial idea, kind of messiness, where it all starts, and to create an exhibition making use of only that content or that material, I think was absolutely significant. And so the impact of the Zuidsmoka exhibition was one thing, but the inspiration that I've found, with the sketchbook exhibition was as profound, but on a different way, in a different way. Perhaps one can draw parallels and compare the two with each other, but it's so unique in its own way. The two exhibitions that we have seen.
Absolutely. I think we're fortunate that we actually got to see that exhibition in 2019, seeing this body of work, and on this very big scale, and now seeing this kind of smaller collection, but a glimpse into the artist's process. And what I find fascinating about William Kentridge is that it seems that he really welcomes any idea. He doesn't limit himself, and I think the notebooks speak of that, that it's really about welcoming any idea that comes into mind. He started the Center for the Less Good Idea. It was started with the Bronwyn, I think it's, now I can't read my own handwriting. I think it's Bronwyn Lee. I will have to correct that if it's not correct. But they started this center, and it's about welcoming what they term the less good idea. And I want to read a little quote that I found, where he says, "Often you start with a good idea. It might seem crystal clear at first, but when you take it off the proverbial drawing board, cracks and fissures emerge in its surface, and they cannot be ignored." And then he talks about following that idea until you get to the secondary, less good idea. And so it's this concept of playing with an idea, and how, the one idea leads to the next idea. And, by building on ideas, you actually get to sort of the heart or the core of something. He says that you recognize those things you didn't know in advance, but knew somewhere inside of you. And so I think there's this theme of welcoming play and welcoming ideas that come to mind. I think that's something that I really got out of this last exhibition. How does that resonate with you in some way?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting observation, the idea of the lesser or the less good idea. I think in certain cases, it might turn out also to be the best idea. If you scribble something down, if you're always aware of your environment. That's Martin Heidegger, the great German philosopher, who talks about being and time, and that profound contribution that he makes, that that we are beings that are constantly aware or uniquely aware of our existence, of us being, being there. What is unique to me is just looking at what he has exhibited through those sketchbooks. Of course, it is a celebration of his process, but he's so uniquely aware of him being, being aware of his context, and so all the scribbles and the notes that is captured in those sketchbooks, I think it's profound ideas. So it's not necessarily the lesser. I would argue that it's not necessarily the lesser important or the lesser good idea. I would perhaps refer to it as these incredible happy moments, that is captured in the sketchbook. And the idea needs to start somewhere, and it's not necessarily mistakes that you make along the way. It's rather these stepping stones towards something. So process, I see the design process as some might call it mistakes within the process, and then you iterate and iterate and iterate until you get to something. Whereas it's all part of the final product, at the end of the day, and all those ideas are essentially part of the DNA of the final product. And so much so that one could argue that, the product is the objective, but perhaps in my view, the process eats the product for breakfast. And that's actually saying that comes from business circles where, one might argue that business strategy is the most important thing. And there's actually a book that's written, that company culture, it's business strategy for breakfast. And I would like to draw from that phrase to say that the process, it's the product for business, because the process is so incredibly important. So I would say all those moments, that is captured in the sketchbook, they are, it's a good thing to note that down. And as you scribble, as you organize your thoughts, you will get to these happy moments that will initiate great ideas in design, and or great outputs as a creative. I think we all need to get to a place where you can achieve a place of deep thinking, place of deep thought. And this is something that I would say is argued by Albert Einstein, when he wrote down his theories on relativity, he always mentions, that, he goes into the space of thought experiments where you start to experiment with various ideas in your mind space, and then you start to scribble these things down, and it's sometimes an incredibly long process, where you go back and forth on your own thoughts, and try to make sense of it all, start to organize your thoughts, according to certain logics. And then from there, again, these happy moments, these moments where the light bulb, just switches on. And it's a moment in time when these things happen. And I think the sketchbook is the incubator for those ideas. It's the platform where those ideas started to take shape and form. And so the lesser good ideas, I would argue for, it is the idea. I would be very pro to those sketchbook scribbles,
Yeah,
and I found it
absolutely.
could be.
So, what role does taking notes and having a notebook or a sketchbook, what role does it play in your own life?
If I reflect on my personal process, or the way, I engage with the design process, it's hand and paper. I think that sensory experience, of having the pen at hand and the paper, the way it feels, that sensory experience, it's a good thing, to engage with a pen and paper. And so I've just so used to it, just to also make use of not necessarily always a sketchbook. It could be just a napkin, at a restaurant, to note down a few ideas before making a sketch. So it happens everywhere. When I look at my desk, there's just, sheets of paper everywhere with notes and sketches. And then amongst other things, if I have the sketchbook, close by at the ready, then of course it becomes something that's a bit more formalized. But I think it's a way for me to order my thoughts. Secondly, I would argue that in the time that we are, of course, living in, all the algorithms that we are exposed to, it becomes incredibly predictive. If I just think about, what happens when you start with infinite scrolling, it's actually the one thing after the other that's exactly the same. It's just a duplication of the same thing over and over again. Whereas when one starts engaging with a sketchbook, you start to tap into the world of imagination, and you are not, of course, we are all influenced by AI and, algorithms. It goes without saying, but to broaden that frame of reference and to tap into the imaginary, I have found that the sketchbook is that place where it becomes that incubation for the unknown, perhaps. And when I talked about these happy moments, this is again where that happens.
So, Conrad, we've been talking about the the idea of not limiting an idea, and also using notebooks to support the creative process. As a lecturer working with students, how do you encourage your students to not limit themselves when it comes to ideation and the design process as well? Does notebooks form a part of that?
Yes, so absolutely. So currently we have the case here at our architecture learning site, where the sketchbooks are assessed, from first year until masters. So we make it an integral part of the studio assessment. So students at the beginning of the semester or the year, they will obtain a sketchbook, and they will fill it with either process work, conceptual ideas, but also workshop sessions, sketchbook sessions that is focusing on sketching, that we assess. So it's part of our assessments
Hmm.
here at the university. So that makes, of course, a big difference. So if you ask the question, how do we encourage that, we rather kind of force the students to make use of a sketchbook, and hopefully, through that process, they will also develop a love for hand drawings. And we encourage it, of course, again, for the student to be, in a position to communicate their ideas, not to jump to the computer generated imagery too quickly. I think just perhaps on that point of computer-aided design and also the assistance that's currently available through AI, it's remarkable to me how instantly the idea is developed or processed through AI. And so to me, there's a missing part in the process. If you do not go through that messiness of it all, which is the design process, where those incredible moments could take place, the unexpected. So if you prompt, a language model or a rendering engine in a certain way, it's going to produce in record time, and that of course its place in industry. To a certain degree, it takes out, and we talked in the beginning of the discussion, that the lesser idea that's captured in a sketchbook, and one could argue maybe it's a mistake, but I think those mistakes are a wonderful thing. You never know where what seemingly could have been a mistake, or one could argue is a mistake, how that could be turned into a winning idea. And that is, those mistakes along the way, or those stepping stones along the way, the messiness of the process, which we could argue is captured in a sketchbook, that gets taken away when you only prompt, from this point onwards, artificial intelligence or machine learning turn out to be. And so this is why we encourage, the students to make use of the sketchbook, not to miss that vital part in the process, from design or ideation, concept development, design development, to perhaps technical investigation. It's all those aspects are pieces of the puzzle, and if you miss one of those pieces, I think it would be unfortunate, because it plays such a large part. The contribution of the hand on paper.
That's so interesting.
If that makes sense.
Absolutely. I think there's so much more that we can talk about just that topic. The how in our culture we're primed in some way to expect immediate results, and how what you're talking about is actually slowing down the process and valuing that, and knowing that's really part of it. There's something crucial that happens in that process, and also the sensory experience of using a pen, using paper. In the beginning of our conversation, you also spoke about William Kentridge being very present in time and also present within his studio. And you actually see that also in some of his films, walking in his studio, his hand on paper, and in some way it's this awareness of having a body and having a body in space. How when we become aware of our bodies, there's something that happens, I think, in the creative process. So I think we've reached some full circle in our conversation, but it looks like you want to add something there before I maybe just ask another question. What we're going to add?
Yeah, I think what you have said is something rather profound, is to slow down the process. It's something that I did not think of, and it's absolutely so. Reaching out again to the students, I think it's something that I'll definitely mention to them as well. Again, to obtain deep thought. You need to slow down the process in order to achieve that space. It's something, perhaps sometimes it could happen in an instant. But to really achieve, that depth, you need to slow down, and it's contemplation and iteration, in order to achieve that deep level of thought. And so I think it's rather quite profound, that making use of a sketchbook or sketching down your ideas, it helps you to slow down. So I think what you have said is absolutely, it's highly notable.
So to come back to the question that I asked in the very beginning, and you said, there might be some new ideas that forms as we talk about this. Well, William Kentridge's process, really. So have you got anything to add around the question that I asked in the beginning about when did you first know that you're a creative and this idea of being a creative person?
It's interesting because as we're talking, I'm thinking about it, in the subconscious here at the back of my mind. Um, I think we need to have the discussion again. So to say, I'm trying to think, how do you package and how do you identify and how do you define the term creativity, or what is it? Because I think again it could mean so many things, and it's all relative at the end of the day. Somebody might think that I'm a creative individual, and somebody else might think, well, no, I'm stuck with my thoughts, and there's very little progress, or iterations, or there's something that there's an issue with my with the process, or ideation, whatever the case might be. I think there's a self-reflection to that, but also how you see yourself in the world and how others view you. Not that that necessarily matter. It matters to some, it might not matter to others, but I think one needs to define and make it out for yourself what is creativity. Pursuit of that definition that might be defined by yourself or by others, or are you lacking in certain departments? But I think overall we are created as creative beings, and so whether you high or low on some scale, whatever that yardstick is, and that's what I'm trying to get to, is how can you measure creativity? What tool can you use to measure, to say, well, this person is creative, this person is not? That inherently, I would argue, we are all creative. It just varies, in terms of ability and output. So whether you're left or right brain, it could be that you're good with numbers and you're incredibly creative in the way you set up a balance sheet, for example, or how you deal with things or whatever. So it could be something that's very analytical, or it could be extremely right brain and you are developing new materials, or very clever with the use of color or mediums, or whatever the case might be. So I think it's so incredibly wide ranging. Maybe if you asked me the question, when did I find out that I was a creative individual, maybe my answer at this very moment in time, thinking aloud, is when I realized that I was born a creative individual or a creative being.
Yes, and I think I'm wondering if having a notebook, putting pen to paper can actually help people connect, with their own creativity. And I agree with you. I also believe that we're all creative beings. Yeah, I think there's a place for having a notebook to actually scribble down your ideas and not limit yourself in that sense. So Conrad, thanks so much for being on the show today. I know that we could have continued talking for so much longer. It's been lovely to just hear your reflections on the exhibition, and I hope we get to go to one of Kentridge's exhibitions again in future. I'm sure we will.
Absolutely, Donna. Thank you very much for having me. It's a great honor. It was a wonderful experience, and I'm looking forward to a follow-up. So it could be part 2,
Fantastic. We'll do.
that we can do. Absolutely. I think it's an incredible initiative. Your podcast, just to celebrate creativity around the world. So I think it's an incredible initiative, and thank you very much for the invitation. I appreciate it.
Pleasure. And yes, I'm looking forward to part 2. We'll do that.